in Romania, we have been talking about informal settlements. Sometimes it's a phenomenon, sometimes it's a spatial phenomenon, sometimes it's social phenomenon specific to Romania, or it was or it is a phenomenon encountered in other European countries, as you know.
Well, it's really something that is very complex and challenging, and as you said, it's part of the spatial development and very much attributed to cities. So it's part of urban development. It's also an economic and social phenomenon, and it has its environmental manifestations. Very often these kinds of formations are in the peri-urban area associated with rapid migration to cities, but also part of the inner city, part of the older parts of the city where the people are overcrowded, and informality is actually very often associated with not necessarily planned uses and unsanitary conditions, lack of services, essential urban services such as water and sanitation. I don't think it's something very new to Europe or the rest of the world. In fact, before the Second World War, there were huge parts of cities that have evolved in this informal, organic way throughout history and gradually have been retrofitted and upgraded. I think a very famous city is Tokyo, for example, which 70% of the city before the Second World War was actually informally built. And gradually planning and urban development comes back to these parts and begins to integrate them in the city. And in some cases, particularly in the 70s, there was a lot of slum clearance and demolition, and urban renewal was associated with this kind of bulldozer type of redevelopment. So we have a fair share of those in Europe, both old and new arrivals to that informal setting. In the post-socialist parts of Europe, in many cases, this wave of expansion is associated with the point of transition to markets in the early 90s, particularly in the southeast part of Europe. I think in places like Belgrade and Tirana, for example. Tirana had an explosive growth, like it tripled the population of the country. And I think in many cases, the reality out there is that these type of informal kind of urban enclaves are there to stay. And so we need, in planning and housing terms and urban development terms, come up with solutions to integrate them in the urban structure and make sure that the residents of these places can actually have access to services in the city, and they can actually have some security, and they can call these places their home.
So we are talking about recognition, official recognition of this formal or informal settlements with or without, let's say, proper or accurate documents.
The formal recognition indeed is in many cases is there, because in some cities these places, even if they are very much associated with the flux of institutions and changing property rights and the lack of coherent planning in the early 90s, 30 years later you have to recognize these places, and the fact that in some cases they have been incorporated in the city proper. They have become part of the urban boundaries as a result of new strategic planning, adopted zoning and various planning regulations. And it was just legitimizing the fact that in many of these so-called enclaves, there were more than 50,000, 100,000 people. So it's a reality that, despite the fact that it's very dynamic and existed and originated informally, it's part of the city very much so. So these people actually are part of the labor market. The children that grow there go to schools. People have started to set up their own services, connect sometimes legally, sometimes illegally to infrastructure such as electricity and water. In some cases, in some of these formations, I've seen people setting up their own minibus companies so that they can get people to the city, they can get people to work, access to medical services during the COVID years. Indeed, it's just very difficult to ignore this order of magnitude and the fact that there are so many families and so many people that are part of these places. So the acknowledgement, whether we talk about legalization or any form of planning integration of some of these formations is the first step. And it comes with a lot of effort and a lot of really specific kinds of measures that each country and indeed every municipality will have to make sure that this is really a legitimate step, that it's a step that begins to cut across the housing system, the planning system, but also the system of urban development and indeed social assistance and social services. So it's a nexus of different systems that need to be integrated, and sometimes it's really challenging because different institutions are responsible for planning or housing or delivery of services in the city, like waste management, transportation, police, the social assistance, for example.
Thank you. Answering, let's say, the next question, because I wanted to discuss about main common issue and main, let's say, difference reported or reported by you or found out by you in these informal settlements in a different country. What are the main common issue? Let's say, let's make a top 3. I don't know. I know it's hard as a researcher, but the main common issue, you could define it.
First of all, they're not the same. Really the manifestation is very different. Sometimes it's really truly a small enclave of, you know, what we call the mahala of really 25 families or households, and sometimes in some cases like in Belgrade or Skopje, or for example in Bar, you know, you have 50,000, 80,000 people. So these are, and then the location is important, the setting is important, the quality of the infrastructure that exists is also very important and defining element. In some cases, for example, in Kosovo and also Serbia and Montenegro, in fact, the quality of these built structures is actually quite good. So it's permanent. It's concrete. It's brick, stone. In fact, in some cases where we looked at details in some pilot projects, that people had property rights, they had ownership. So the only thing that was illegal or informal was the lack of building permit. So I think that the process of acknowledgement and regularization was kind of done halfway through the back door. So in many cases, so it's a laddering of different characteristics and different manifestations of informality. The big problem is really to understand and analyze the reality that you're dealing with, and understand that it's not a uniform solution, that it's not really one size fits all, but there should be like a predictable way of integration. And sometimes it's about the legalization, it's acknowledging the property rights and documenting the technical issues. Sometimes it's moving beyond that and incorporating that in the plan and dealing with planning by exception, and indeed grandfathering a lot of the places that are already built. And then beyond that is then the provision of infrastructure and making sure that people have access to essential services such as the road or, you know, the power, the water. But most of the problems are associated indeed with the quality, really the people on one hand, and the place, I would say. The place is very important, where it is, its quality, its size, its kind of, sometimes these informal settlements are in absolutely amazing places where people have the best view of the city. I mean, they've actually taken over environmentally sensitive areas, public spaces. Indeed, and in some cases it's just adjacent to the landfill, right? So a big difference in terms of what can stay, whether it should stay, and the way it's incorporated in the further development strategy of the city. But also on the people side, it's very important to understand that in some cases we deal with people that are indeed low income, people that are segregated from society, people that are refugees. This is really one disaster after another that has affected their lives and their livelihoods. So there is a genuine cry to help and assist. And then the solutions are very different. And in other cases, you know, these are middle class households. It's a mix. And indeed, they even have the power to negotiate and legalize a lot faster. So again, this is just illustrating, you know, kind of the spectrum. But if you think about the place on one hand, which is kind of associated with location and space and ownership, and the people on the other, it's very important to be able to really navigate these dynamic relationships and come up with a reasonable strategy for integration.
From your experience, what are the main dominant approach of public administration from Europe or American continent regarding this phenomenon? We are talking here about ignorance, about making elements working like regulation. We are talking here about moving the problem to the neighborhood, like relocation, or external relocation or internal relocation, from your experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that sadly, in a lot of countries, the informal settlements actually grow faster than the city proper. And in the post-socialist context, interestingly, we are dealing with, in most of the cases, with shrinking cities. To the point where in some cities, you know, over 25% of the housing stock is actually vacant. But in some very often large metropolitan areas, people continue to migrate to these places because they are places where jobs are available, places of hope and opportunity. And because the housing market is so tight, and I think that we ended up after the transition with very high rates of home ownership, really that entry into the housing system is not necessarily possible, which in most cities is through the renting sector, right? And then there is a very small residual, very restricted sector of public or social housing. And in a lot of countries in Europe, in the southern part of Europe, the situation is similar. Again, we have a larger share of a private rental market and a very small sliver of social housing. So by definition, a lot of people, the newcomers, and especially refugees, and that's an unfortunate reality that Europe had to deal with, you know, going back to the breakup of Yugoslavia and then the influx of refugees from Africa, and now the more recent events with Ukraine. A lot of people actually are trapped in this situation where the housing system is not really flexible. And we end up with this dichotomy of so many empty homes. Like we have officially across Europe, we have about 8 million homes that are empty. And we have about 9 million homeless people. And excluding the more recent refugees, no one really has the numbers. So there is this really inefficiency in the housing system, but it's not just a housing problem. The fact that these informal places grow a lot faster is that people actually begin to find a place there, and that is a stepping stone, and they start working, and they are fueling the informal economy. So it's a cycle of informality that doesn't really stop, and it's not confined just to informal settlements. It's bigger than that. So it's not just about being forced to acknowledge it and come to terms with the next steps, but it's also something that from a societal point of view is very important, so that children actually grow up in a different environment where they really call this their home, they go to school, and they have a different economic prospect. So indeed, thinking about what we can do as planners and designers is very, very important. Having kind of a sustained commitment at different levels of government is also important. This is not about trial and error. This is affecting too many people. Cities are very, very important drivers of European economies. These are highly urbanized countries, where indeed in many places the share of the urban population is over 65 to 80%. So we cannot really ignore the way things work because it's detrimental to the well-being of the country as a whole. So making sure that the housing system actually begins to be more efficient and indeed more open to entry, not necessarily through the laddering of home ownership, which is what a lot of countries have embraced, including the post-socialist countries, recognizing these informal formations and beginning to integrate them first in the property rights system and then second in the urban economic system is very important, and then layering that, and so really formalizing it, feeling that these people are part of the city, they have rights and they have responsibilities, is the way to go. And I think that it's also part of the global move in that regard. A lot of the international agencies have experimented with resettlement. A lot of countries in Europe still resettle people into affordable and social housing, but that is not, it's not a feasible way to actually deal with the very large number of existing populations that are part of the informal sector, and also the newcomers. And so perhaps a better way is to begin to use the potential and the social capital and the sweat equity of the people that live in those settlements, and recognize them and mobilize that social and physical capital in their efforts, so that they can begin to improve their living conditions. They can begin to help themselves and also provide essential infrastructure. What has been very, very useful, and indeed Latin America is a good example of that, is really providing schools, community clinics is one of the first steps, not necessarily the technical infrastructure, but that social infrastructure that is beginning to build capacity within the people themselves, getting them to really benefit immediately and build up on that, and incorporating the children, the seniors that are there and they're willing to help. And that is something that we need to recognize as good practice. And also what is happening in a lot of the Latin American informal settlements that are part of big cities such as Rio de Janeiro, Brazil and other places. It's the fact that the private sector recognizes the economic potential and the power of these settlements. So private institutions move in, banks move in, businesses move in, production moves in, and creates local jobs. So it's really interesting how you could start small with what I call incremental urbanism and build on it.
You gave, let's say, an example of Latin American experience, but what about Europe? Can you describe a case study example, starting from recognition till full regularization of these informal settlements? So you have in mind an European example here?
I think that, illustrating possible solutions, and again, we have to think about these as laddering of options, depending on, again, the place and the people that actually inhabit the place and their characteristics. In the European context, both in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, resettlement is of a lot of the people in informal settlements is something that has been pursued. But again, given the cost of social housing, and indeed it has made a small difference. Portugal, but also Spain and also Italy had these large-scale programs that were initiated in the 80s, and they still continue to build new social housing or provide preferential treatment of certain households that are part of the informal housing market and resettle them in social housing. That is not necessarily, again, whether it's feasible if you have 200,000 people really, and the rate of production of new social housing is so small, of less than 500 units per year, that's a very small number that can be accommodated. So it took a very long time. These commitments on a large scale were made in the 80s. These were different times, fiscally and economically. These European countries were in a different position. What is done today is through a lot of individual subsidies, housing allowances. People are actually assisted to find accommodation in the private rental market. And that is a kind of a more fiscally sustainable solution because, again, the cost is not associated with the capital intensive building and provision of new homes, but it is really using the potential of the existing stock to match the needs of the person and also the landlord. And also it brings some transparency in the rental market. But that is also possible in places where indeed the private rental market exists. And it has a lot of potential for post-socialist countries, especially because you have very, very high vacancy rates. You have very high vacancy rates in places like Bucharest or Prague or Warsaw. These are high growth cities. And the fact that people withhold housing from the market means that they don't have confidence and they are not really willing to release it. So a system of housing allowances will help that equation. So that is another solution that is widely adopted in European countries. Then there is the planning process. In many cases, as I mentioned, there were a series of amnesties as far as the declaration of property is concerned, so that places are registered in the cadastre for kind of a notional amount of money so that they exist. Then there is the planning effort. A lot of that has been done in Belgrade, in places in Croatia, places in also series of those amnesties with some limited extent. I cannot say that that's a uniform solution that works very well, but in some cases where this was really built in a solid way, but in complete violation of planning, it's a natural step. It's a way to begin to integrate it in the process. In many cases, it's just simple inclusion in the city boundaries that was done. Doesn't mean that it delivers urban services, but again, it builds confidence. Just like you say, Mihai, it's not necessarily good practice, but it's a pragmatic step further to assist the regularization of large-scale formations. In places like Rome, I mean, these neighborhoods continue to exist. The last time I looked, there were at least 27 neighborhoods. So they keep growing. And the more you do, I mean, it seems that it draws more people. But indeed, working with the people themselves to actually help them help themselves is the way to go. And making sure that, you know, there are small steps, they begin to pay a small amount of rent for the land or the place that they inhabit, that they begin to improve the conditions of what they have. Habitat for Humanity has some interesting pilot projects in a number of European countries. They actually take this people-centered approach. They work with the household, with the local community. They teach people how to, you know, bring in sanitation in the home, improve the conditions, provide microloans, because indeed that is also, you know, there's cost associated with that. In again, building confidence, making it possible through sweat equity and kind of an institutional mechanism to help improve the conditions. And it seems that is the way to go. It's again, this incremental urbanism, kind of recognizing the fact that people start living somewhere and they build better, and that is very important. They build better, they actually invest their own resources, they take the risks, and we help them stage this process and navigate the complexity of planning and bureaucratic, sometimes government systems at different levels. And then we come and we plan retroactively. We have to recognize the fact that in many cases, this is, again, revisiting the past. And that's the way a lot of European cities have been created over centuries.
But from your experience, the public authority or entity in charge regularization, these informal settlements, ask the need to the citizen, no matter they are inside the community or outside? Well,
that kind of participatory planning is really difficult when you have so many people that are part of this informal setting. Like, for example, in Tirana, you know, in the early 2000s, like the formal city was still showing up at let's say 350,000 people. In fact, there were 800,000 people that were part of Greater Tirana. And even if you look at a lot of these aerial photographs they show, I mean, it's just the land that is taken over is 7 times the formal city. So how do you engage? How do you consult? There are different settings. It's just a mission impossible. So not surprisingly, Tirana was the city when I looked at strategic planning, which is the new, more strategic and participatory way to do planning, as opposed to, you know, the top-down approach that we used to. There were so many attempts, and I think that it managed to get its strategic plan approved, well, maybe in 2012, 2014. So it takes years, and indeed you cannot even consult with everyone and take all the needs into account. So there is obviously a fine line to that participatory engagement, but some decisions need to be made, and they're strategic decisions. And as planners and infrastructure specialists will tell you, they have to be done for the benefit of the city as a whole. And it's very difficult then to take into account and satisfy all the long lists that people develop in different neighborhoods, because something has to be eliminated and something has to give, because roads need to actually make the city accessible and connect the city to the airport and in other productive places. So I think that it's challenging, and in many cases where I've seen the planning community and the public authorities have made a genuine attempt to move towards more engaged and participatory process. It has never been perfect. And it's very difficult to actually make it operational in these circumstances where informality is so prevalent. The same is the story, and I think that there were lots of international consultants and agencies, myself involved in many of these exercises, trying genuinely to help. But it's really a reasonable compromise between the needs of a community and also the city at large. And also planning by definition is a long-term process. It's a process that analyzes the present but looks to the future. So you're looking at something that takes into account the future needs of the people of this place in the next decade or two. So again, it's more strategic in nature, and it's bound to affect some people more than others. Although we try to make it equitable and fair, it never is perfect. But having said that, there have been positive attempts to actually incorporate a lot of these places in the city proper. And in some cases, like in Albania, there was a particular agency at the central level that was set up to actually forcefully administer and deal with the regularization, the property rights. Sometimes you have to do that because the municipalities really don't have the capacity and the resources to deal with these issues. And so there should be a reasonable collaboration between the central level, and some countries have regional levels of government. In some cases that was taken by this regional entity because it was in the peri-urban area. It wasn't really part of a particular municipality. And I think that UN Habitat recognizes that in the next 20 and 30 years, that level of government is going to be central for urban development and metropolitan development, because it's very often outside of the city boundaries, and it's in that interim area. It's a hybrid. So difficult to say and provide a uniform solution, but and I think at one point I did a kind of comparison, particularly looking at cities in the Southeast Europe, the post-socialist cities that actually tried very hard to deal with these issues and come to terms with different manifestations of informality. So you could see the range of different policies, but I think that there should be a really reasonable involvement of central government agencies dealing with regional issues and infrastructure, as well as the housing issues. Housing issues still continue to be central to the solution. And also municipalities. At the municipal level, they are the crisis managers. They really are at the interface between the people that are residents of informal settlements and governments.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it depends with what tools you analyze the settlements, because sometimes if you are looking or analyzing only satellite image, starting from Copernicus program, American program, no matter what source of satellite image we are working, or orthophoto plans, aerial photo plans, etc., we see that this community are increasing. If we are looking at official data census, you can see that sometimes the same informal settlements decrease, because some person are not quantified or simply not asked or numbered in the process.
Yeah.
So basically, we are, as you explained, we are talking about increasing of these informal settlements, no matter what the specification. How can we stop, as a final question, we stop this phenomenon?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we can stop that. It's a fact of life again, and it's also the fact that for economic reasons, people continue to move to these places. In many countries, it's associated with the rural to urban migration or intra-urban migration. I think that it's just, for a lot of people, it's just finding jobs. And even in many cases where they have been resettled in social housing, they actually return back to this community because it's so close to the jobs. In some cases, it's just a lot of these jobs are service jobs. They actually work in the service sector. They very often work informally, right? It's not necessarily that they can afford to actually formally rent or even travel. In many cases, like the mega cities of Mexico City, for example, or Rio de Janeiro, they just cannot really get from one place to another. So social housing is at one end of the city and they work in another, so they come back to the favela. And it's just the complexity of cities and urban economies. They're so intertwined and so complex that it's very difficult to predict how people will react, but they are going after the most rational decision for themselves and their family. I think that the challenge with refugees and the influx of refugees that Europe has is profoundly different. This is just, it is unfortunately going to fuel the informality. It's just sadly an unintended consequence of massive relocation of people. The other issue is poverty. It's just, again, cities attract a lot of the poor urban migrants. And it's just a city of hope. It's a city of lights where they go because they can find a kind of a job that will keep them going and help their family. But they cannot really afford to be part of the formal housing market. So that is unfortunate reality. So for the urban poor, I don't think we can stop that. What we can aim to do is provide these opportunities so that indeed the people that are part of the informal settlements begin to help themselves, and that social mix begins to actually lift all boats out of poverty and despair and deprivation. We also, and that's very important for the post-socialist cities, we want to stop this being a business model for development. Unfortunately, that is a reality in many places because of the rapid restructuring of economic, social planning systems, property rights systems, and again, also the large share of the gray economy and remittances that come from abroad and really channeled into the real estate market informally. So that is something that indeed countries need to address. And I think that it's, for example, the Baltic states, places like Poland have managed to do that. I think that this is a very different world, a different reality of informal development, and it has to become quite clear that this is not a desirable way to develop real estate and go and legalize it after the fact and manipulate different pieces of legislation. But for the urban poor, unfortunately, I'm not sure that we can stop it, but we can really come to terms that it's a fact of urban life and part of growing cities. And indeed do our best to, again, work this nexus of housing planning and also urban development, social assistance, so that it actually prevents a lot more of that informality, because in some cases, middle class households end up in this world. It's so constrictive to actually be part of the formal housing. So that is the exit option. And if the housing system, if the housing market works better, these people will be living somewhere else. They would start laddering their housing career in the rental market, or it will be a different story, a different narrative. And that is also very important. I mean, as experts, we can help and we can engage communities. It's also important to keep in mind that it's not just about technical solutions, as you said, Mihai. I mean, with the drones and the satellite images and better digital systems, the regularization could move forward very quickly. But what is really important and makes the difference is engaging the people and also the authorities that bring in the infrastructure in a meaningful way, so that they start working together and align limited resources. And I think that in many cases, when you engage people, they feel that this is a promise. We want everything. We want a park, we want a school, we want a bridge. And well, there is no fiscal capacity. So indeed, one has to set up the tone of these engagements in the right way, so that it's not really creating a lot of unfairness and inequity. It has to be transparent, and it has to be set up in such a way that people understand their rights and their responsibilities. They start to contribute, whether in a small way, whether, with their labor, volunteering, really, even in the best examples, like in Sweden, in Stockholm, for example, in the management of housing, if they've done something very simple, employing to do cleaning and gardening and landscaping, some of the residents, and starting to pay for that, right? And when you are actually working on those issues, you sort of start policing the others that before will vandalize and will actually, so that is the kind of stake that you build in some cases with low-income people. They don't have the financial needs, but they have the ability to contribute and be part of this process. And when people see small improvements, what they've done in some of the informal settlements is constructing with people's labor, very simple public space where children can play, using recycled materials, building confidence, and then they get together there, right? So they know each other, and then they do something more complicated after that. So, and this is a practice of incremental laddering of opportunities. But again, it's about that kind of engagement. It's not really the engagement of entitlement that is going to make a difference. And of course, the fact that in the post-COVID world, a lot of people are pushed into poverty, and we are going to see, as a result of the pandemic, and whether it's pandemic or endemic, we are going to see a lot more inequality in our cities. So there would be places that will continue to shrink, and then there will be other places that continue to act as magnets for people and businesses. So in this unequal and world that is very risky and unpredictable, I think we just need to start building better and learn how to live together.
Exactly. Somehow you presented also our conclusion, because in our community, their needs resume to a basic park, not with, let's say, different installation, specific installation, very expensive. No, just a simple plain park where to play football or basketball, I don't know. And water. They are basic needs that were presented and requested by the community.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I love the bridge idea, but I'm not sure that it's feasible or, fair, because you have a very small community. But maybe you could actually run like a shuttle bus that will provide public transportation to the city or places that they need to go. Building a pedestrian bridge is I don't know, it's 18 million plus. So maybe what they need is water, and maybe what they need is heating, not necessarily the opportunity to go across the river, but maybe they could get on a shuttle bus, and all of these 50 people could actually get to. Anyway, this gives you an idea how you could stage the process and do things that will benefit more people and are going to be more feasible. I think that in my work, quite frankly, sometimes we look for the instant, just like children look for instant gratification. They want a chocolate, they want a new toy. They don't want to wait 5 years to get it, because 5 years down the road, they're not interested in it. So it makes sense to do something small and build confidence, like the small park. And in one of my images, I was showing this. I think soccer is very popular in Romania, but also in a lot of Latin American and European cities. So creating that playground and also getting local artists to illustrate it, and getting some of the seniors to build simple benches from, I don't know, recyclable materials is easy. And then everyone is there watching people, and you have the eyes on the street. And then some people also start community gardening. They start to grow vegetables, and then they start trading that with others. You have cabbage and I have carrots. So these are the kinds of things that are about engagement and empowerment. There's this book, if you want to see, it's open access. And it's actually, you can download it, and it's about 7 countries and 12 cities building affordable housing. I mean, a lot of them are like European, London, Paris, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, New York, Chicago. It's in my signature, and it's because it's open access. You can actually download the whole book or certain chapters. And I think I have a couple of pieces that I published on legalization, regularization, where you might be able to see what different cities did in different countries. I'll try to find them and email them to you to just see what was done in Albania and Serbia and Montenegro, and these are not perfect, but on the technical side, you know, they were they were a solution. So you could have a look at that and maybe follow up in your next project.